Imagine waking up one day to realize you have always worshipped something you don't remember choosing, that your prayers, your thoughts, even your fears, were never yours to begin with. Join me as we dive into a story of forgotten gods, erased history, and a world that was never what you thought it was. A world that is waking up, whether you're ready or not. Stay with me until the end, because some things once remembered can never be forgotten. The rain poured relentlessly over Huanghe village, drenching the cobblestone paths that led to the ancient church on the hill. Built over 200 years ago, the church had stood firm through wars and disasters, but the villagers whispered of something unnatural lurking inside. Pastor Minjun stood at the grand wooden doors, his fingers trembling as he inserted the rusted key into the lock. His cassock clung to his damp skin, and he could feel the church breathing as though it was alive. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of burnt incense and something rotting beneath it. The wooden pews stretched into darkness, and the massive crucifix above the altar seemed to watch him. A sudden whisper slithered through the empty halls. Minjun froze, his breath catching in his throat. The church was supposed to be empty, but he knew what he heard. A voice. Suddenly, the church bells rang on their own, shattering the silence. Minjun staggered backward, heart pounding as he turned toward the entrance. Someone, or something, was watching him. The church door creaked as Minjun stepped backward. His breath was uneven, the echoes of the bell still ringing in his skull. The air inside felt wrong, thicker than before, charged with something unseen. A low whispering sound curled through the rafters, like wind slipping through cracks in a tomb. Minjun whipped around, clutching his cross necklace. The whispering wasn't the wind, it was inside the church. His eyes scanned the dark pews, the altar, the towering crucifix above, and then movement. A figure sat silently in the last row, barely visible in the candlelight. Minjun's breath hitched. A girl. Small, frail, dressed in a white hanbok, her black hair curtain-like around her face. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her head slightly tilted, as if listening to something unseen. "Who are you?" Mingjun's voice was barely more than a whisper. He took a step forward, but the wooden floor groaned beneath his weight, and the girl's head snapped up. Her lips didn't move, but Minjun heard it. Her voice, curling around his mind like smoke. "He is listening." Minjun stumbled backward, gripping his cross tighter. The girl just sat there, unmoving. The air around her shifted, like a ripple in reality itself. Then, something moved behind her, a shadow, barely perceptible, slithering like black ink spilling across the wooden pews. The church bells rang again, a sharp, deafening clang, but this time, they didn't stop. They rang and rang, faster, louder, screaming into the night. And through it all, Han Su-bin just sat there, smiling. The church bells wouldn't stop ringing, their deafening clangs ripped through the night, sending vibrations through the wooden pews and rattling the stained glass windows. The sound felt wrong. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning. Minjun tried to steady his breathing. His fingers gripped the silver cross at his neck, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He turned back toward Han Su-bin. She was still sitting in the last pew, still smiling. The floorboards beneath her creaked. Something moved. Not her. Something else. A faint slithering noise scraped against the wood, a sound like wet fabric dragging across the floor. Minjun took a step forward, forcing his voice to stay steady. "What is under the pews?" Subin tilted her head, her smile never fading. "Would you like to see?" Before Mingjun could answer, the candles blew out. The church plunged into utter blackness. Then, movement. A scraping sound against the wood, then another. Slow, deliberate, as if something was crawling through the pews. Minjun couldn't move. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. His eyes strained against the darkness, but the pews were too deep, too vast. Something was there, but he couldn't see it. A whisper, "No!" A dozen whispers rose from the pews, overlapping, distorted. Voices speaking in a language Min-jun didn't understand. "Come closer. Join us. He's watching." Min-jun staggered back, but his foot hit something. He turned sharply, his heart slamming against his ribs. Han Soo-bin was standing right behind him. She looked up at him, her expression blank. "It's already inside you." Min-jun felt his knees go weak. The whispering voices grew louder, overlapping, crawling into his mind. And then, the thing in the pews moved. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him. Han Soo-bin's smile widening. Min-jun's vision blurred as the air in the church seemed to collapse inward, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. His hands trembled, his pulse roaring in his ears. The thing in the pews was getting closer. His instincts screamed, "Run, run, run!" But his body wouldn't listen. The air was thick as tar, heavy as stone. The whispers had burrowed into his skull, 1,000 voices chanting in unison. Min-jun's eyes darted to Han Soo-bin. She stood unnaturally still, her white hanbok glowing faintly in the dark. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. Then, it moved. From the depths of the pews, a shape emerged. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal. It was something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. Min-jun tried to speak, tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat. The creature knew him. It had been waiting for him. "Pastor Min-jun." The voice was not one, but many. It filled the church, reverberating through the walls, shaking the floor beneath his knees. Han Soo-bin smiled wider. "It finally found you." The creature's head tilted. It was studying him. Its presence pushed against the edges of reality, warping the very air around it. Min-jun's breath came in shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. This wasn't possible. And yet, the thing in the pews had his name. "Leave." His voice barely broke the silence. "Leave this place." The church laughed. The walls groaned as if the entire building was breathing. The floor beneath him shifted like rippling water. Han Soo-bin giggled. "You don't understand, Pastor. You can't make it leave." Her black eyes locked onto his. Because it was never outside. It was always inside you. Min-jun staggered back. The weight in his chest grew heavier, pressing against his ribs, filling his lungs with a darkness he couldn't cough out. The thing in the pews tilted its head again. Then it spoke one last time. "You brought us here, Min-jun." The church screamed. The shadows collapsed inward, and Min-jun was swallowed whole. Darkness devoured Min-jun. There was no floor beneath him, no air around him, only an endless void swallowing him whole. The church was gone. The world was gone. He tried to scream, but his voice never came. His limbs were heavy, his veins burning with something cold and wrong. He wasn't falling, he was sinking. Then, whispers, not from around him, from inside, voices curling around his ribs, clawing at his throat, slithering through his bloodstream. The darkness shattered. Min-jun's body slammed onto cold stone, air rushing back into his lungs. He gasped, choked, coughed. His hands pressing against the wet floor beneath him. Where was he? The church was gone. He was in a tunnel, narrow, endless. The walls pulsed, damp and slick, like the inside of something alive. Min-jun tried to stand, but his legs were weak, his vision blurred. He looked down at his hands and nearly screamed. His veins were black. "Still think you can escape?" The voice echoed from the shadows. Min-jun spun around, his breath caught in his throat. Han Soo-bin stood at the end of the tunnel, her white hanbok untouched by the filth around her. But her eyes, they weren't human anymore. She stepped closer, bare feet silent against the stone. "You were always one of us." "No," Minjun rasped. "I'm a priest," Subin giggled. "Do you really believe that?" The walls of the tunnel trembled. The black veins in Minjun's arms pulsed. And suddenly, he remembered. A flash of red robes, candles burning in a forbidden temple. A ritual. A voice calling his name. His knees buckled, his hands pressed against his skull. "No, no, no. I left this behind." Minjun's voice was a whisper. "I was cleansed." Subin tilted her head. "Then why are you still cursed?" Minjun's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. The thing inside him moved. Then, the tunnel collapsed. Stone split, darkness poured in. Han Subin's voice echoed. "Come home, Minjun." The last thing he saw was his own shadow splitting open, revealing something with teeth. And then, nothing. Minjun gasped, awake. He wasn't in the tunnel anymore. He wasn't anywhere. He was floating in a vast, endless void, his body weightless, suspended in nothingness. But he wasn't alone. Something was breathing with him, a slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale, like a beast lurking just beyond sight. Then, the whispers returned. Soft at first. A dozen voices, 100, 1,000. Whispering in a language that curled into his bones, ancient and unholy. Minjun's pulse pounded in his ears. He looked down at his hands and froze. His veins weren't just black anymore. They were moving. "No," he choked. "This isn't real." But it was. The space around him shattered like glass, and suddenly he was standing in a church. But not his church. A ruined temple, ancient and crumbling, its walls lined with red candles dripping wax onto the stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of blood and incense. Footsteps. Minjun turned slowly, his chest seized with dread. Han Subin stood at the center of the temple. But she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a line of robed figures, their faces obscured by hoods, and in their hands. Minjun's breath hitched. He knew this place. He had been here before. Memories crashed into him like a wave. A younger version of himself, dressed in red robes, chanting, holding a knife, standing before an altar soaked in blood. He had never been cleansed. "You tried to leave us," Subin whispered, "but you can't leave what's inside you." Minjun stumbled back, his lungs seizing, his reflection flickered in the temple walls. But it wasn't his. It was something taller, twisted, grinning. "No," Minjun gasped. You were chosen, Minjun." Subin's voice was almost tender. The hooded figures stepped forward, their knives raised, and behind them, something else moved. Something massive, something that had been waiting. The red candles snuffed out, the temple walls collapsed. Minjun's scream was swallowed by the void. And then, silence. Minjun's lungs burned. He fell through the abyss, the ruined temple shattering around him like brittle glass. Fragments of red candles, old scriptures, and whispering shadows spiraled around him. He tried to scream, but the air was thick as tar. The whispers crawled inside him, pressing against his ribs, wrapping around his spine like coiling roots. Then, sudden impact. Minjun slammed onto a cold marble floor. The pain was immediate, bone-shaking. He gasped for breath, his fingers scraping against the smooth surface beneath him. He was in a cathedral, but not one he recognized. This place was wrong. The stained glass windows were black as oil, shifting as if alive. The altar at the front was not empty, but occupied. Minjun's heartbeat stuttered. The pews weren't empty. They were filled with them. Rows upon rows of hooded figures, their faces missing, just smooth, featureless skin where their eyes and mouths should be. They sat in perfect silence, waiting. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, they began to sing. Minjun's ears rang. The sound wasn't music, it was something else. Something wrong. A song with no words, no melody, only a cursed vibration that rattled his bones. Minjun clutched his chest. His veins burned. The blackness in his blood responded to the sound. A realization slammed into him. This wasn't a church. This was a summoning. And he was the offering. At the altar, a figure finally moved. A man in blood-red robes, his hands clasped in prayer. When he lifted his head, Minjun's breath caught. He was looking at himself. An older version, twisted, tainted, eyes completely black. "Welcome home," the doppelganger whispered. "You've finally heard the song." Minjun staggered back. "No. This is..." The choir of the damned sang louder. The walls trembled. The altar split open. And from beneath it, something enormous began to rise. Minjun's body froze. His veins pulled toward it, drawn to the thing waking beneath the altar. Because it wasn't just any creature. It was his, and it had come to claim him. Minjun couldn't move. His body was frozen, his veins burning, his pulse sinking with the cursed hymn echoing through the cathedral. The hooded figures did not stop singing. At the altar, his twisted doppelganger spread his arms wide, his red robes flowing like spilled blood. The cracks beneath his feet deepened, and from within them, a black fire began to rise. Minjun's breath hitched. The thing beneath the altar was waking. It was ancient. It was hungry. And somehow, it was connected to him. Then, his reflection spoke. "You never escaped, Minjun." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "You only forgot." Memories surged through Minjun's skull, a temple lost to time, red candles burning, the taste of iron on his tongue. A ritual. His own voice whispering incantations in the dark. Minjun's stomach lurched. He had led a ceremony. He had been one of them. And now he was being called back. "No," Minjun whispered. "This isn't me." His reflection laughed. A low, hollow sound. "Then why is it inside you?" The black veins in Minjun's arms pulsed. The presence beneath the altar reacted, pulling harder at his blood. The hooded figures bowed. The altar split wide. And finally, it emerged. Minjun choked on his breath. He should have run, but his body was no longer his. Because the thing in the altar was not a god. It was a piece of him, and it had finally come home. Minjun's heartbeat slowed. The entity towering before him was more than a monster. It was him. His reflection at the altar had not been lying. The black veins in his arms, the whispers in his head, the hymn that rattled his bones, they had always been calling him back. The hooded figures knelt, their faceless heads bowed in worship. The hymn rose into a crescendo, no longer words but a force, a command. "Accept what you are," his dark reflection whispered. Minjun's fingers twitched. His body was not his own. Every cell in his being was screaming, not to run, but to surrender. Because the truth was clear now. He had never been a priest. He had been a vessel. He clenched his jaw. "I won't do this." The altar shook. His dark reflection sighed. "You don't have a choice." Minjun's body lurched forward. He wasn't walking. He was being pulled. The entity's power surged through his veins, locking onto the thing inside him, the part of him that had never left. "No," he gasped. His fingers dug into the stone. "I am not yours." The hymn stopped. Silence rang through the cathedral. And then, Han Soo-bin's laughter. Min Jun's eyes snapped to her. You knew. She stepped forward, unfazed by the writhing darkness. Of course. Her black eyes gleamed. I told you. It was always inside you. Min Jun's breath hitched. It was true. There had never been an outside force corrupting him, because he had brought this upon himself. The entity rumbled. The doppelganger's voice softened. Just let go. The air thickened. The altar split further. Min Jun's mind screamed. Because he knew. He had no choice. Moon Jun's muscles seized. The pull toward the altar was unbearable now, like an unseen force was ripping him apart and stitching him back together at the same time. His veins pulsed, thick with something black and ancient. His doppelganger tilted his head, watching with something close to pity. You still don't get it, he murmured. You aren't fighting us. Min Jun's breath hitched. His vision blurred. He tried to push himself backward, but his feet were no longer his own. You're fighting yourself. Han Soo-bin's voice cut through the silence. You've already lost. She stood on the steps leading up to the altar, watching him like a child studying an insect caught in a web. Min Jun's pulse pounded. No, this wasn't over. He bit down on the inside of his cheek, forcing his mind to focus. He wasn't just a body to be claimed, he was still himself. And if they wanted him, they'd have to take him by force. The hooded figures in the pews stopped their hymn. The entire cathedral seemed to shift, like it was waiting for his next move. Han Soo-bin let out a long, slow sigh. Well, if you want to make this difficult. She raised a single hand. The shadows lunged. Min Jun barely had time to react. The darkness wrapped around his arms, his throat, his legs, and pulled him under. The world vanished. No cathedral, no altar, only void. And then he opened his eyes. The ground beneath him was ash. The sky was a swirling abyss of nothingness, and in the distance, something moved. Not the entity, not the cult. Another Min Jun, and another, and another. Dozens, hundreds of versions of himself, standing in the mist, some whispering, some kneeling in prayer, some staring at him with hollow eyes. His mind fractured. What is this? A voice whispered in his ear. His own voice. This is what you became every time you chose to forget. Min Jun staggered back. The realization crashed into him like a tidal wave. He had been here before, and each time he had tried to run, and each time he had failed. Min Jun's breath came in ragged gasps. His bare feet sank into the ashen ground, the cold seeping through his skin. Around him, the other versions of himself stood in eerie silence. Some were whispering, some praying, some simply watching. His pulse pounded in his ears. He took a cautious step forward, his body feeling lighter and yet heavier, as if something unseen was dragging at his bones. One of the other Min Juns turned. His face was eerily calm, his eyes entirely black, his lips parted, and Min Jun heard his own voice. You always come back here? Min Jun's chest tightened. No, I was taken here. Another version of himself stepped forward from the mist, older, worn with scars across his face. His robes were ripped and stained. No, the older Min Jun said, his voice heavy with sorrow. You walked here willingly. Min Jun shook his head violently. No, I was cursed. I was used. I was choked. The whisper came from all of them, 100 voices, all his own, speaking in perfect unison. Min Jun's stomach lurched. He backed away, but there was no escaping himself. The black veins in his arms pulsed. The voices grew louder. And then, from the center of the wasteland, the first Min Jun stepped forward. The one who had started it all. Min Jun's mind reeled. He had always thought there was an origin to his suffering, a point where it all began, a time when he was just a man. But now he saw the truth. There was no beginning. There was no escape. There was only this endless cycle. Han Subin's laughter echoed in the void. "See?" her voice mocked. "You never had a choice." Minjun's fingers dug into his own arms. He wanted to deny it, but the other versions of himself, they were all proof. Each one had thought they could escape. Each one had thought they were the real Minjun. But there was no real Minjun. There was only the thing that kept returning. The black veins in his skin burned as the void around him began to collapse. The wasteland was pulling him back to where he belonged. To the altar. To the thing that waited beneath it. And this time, he wouldn't resist. Minjun collapsed to his knees. The weight of his past selves pressed into him like an avalanche, their voices curling around his ears, their hollow eyes digging into his soul. His breath came in shallow gasps. The black veins in his arms were no longer just under his skin. They were branching outward, forming shifting tendrils of darkness, curling into the air. The first Minjun stepped forward, his expression calm. "There is no fight left in you." Minjun tried to shake his head, but the truth weighed too heavily. The cycle was real. The ritual was real. He had always come back. The sky shuttered. The wasteland began to crack beneath them, like an ancient mirror fracturing. It was time. Han Subin's voice came softly, but it echoed everywhere. "Let go, Minjun. It's easier if you do." Minjun's bones ached, his body trembled, his limbs barely obeying him. But the black veins in his skin had already chosen for him. The wasteland collapsed, and he fell. Then, light. Minjun's eyes snapped open. He was back in the cathedral, kneeling at the altar. The hooded figures still surrounded him, their hymn resuming in a low rhythmic hum. His reflection stood over him, watching patiently. "You understand now?" Minjun's hands curled into fists. His throat was dry, but the words left his lips before he even realized he was speaking. "I was never meant to leave." The hooded figures bowed. Han Subin let out a soft laugh. "You finally see?" Minjun's body moved on its own. He wasn't resisting anymore, because he never could. His reflection smiled, not mockingly, not cruelly, welcoming him home. And for the first time, Minjun smiled back. The altar rumbled. The entity beneath it stirred. And this time, Minjun didn't run, because he was never meant to. The cathedral pulsed. It was no longer just a place. It was a being, a breathing entity that had been waiting for this moment since the beginning. Minjun stood before the altar, his body still, his veins burning black. The hooded figures bowed lower, their chant rising into a frenzied hymn. The sound was no longer words, it was power wrapping around Minjun's soul, pulling him toward something deeper. Minjun's reflection stood at the altar, waiting. His older self, his truer self. "You know what must be done," his doppelganger murmured. Minjun did. And he was no longer afraid. Han Subin stepped forward, standing just beyond the altar. Her dark eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "You're ready." Her voice was neither cold nor kind. It was simply the truth. Minjun stepped up to the altar. His fingers touched the cold stone, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No fear, no hesitation, no doubt, because this was what he had always been meant for. The thing beneath the altar stirred. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the floor, a sound older than words, a voice that had whispered to him his entire life. Minjun's doppelganger raised his hands. "It's time." Minjun reached into his robes and pulled out the ceremonial dagger. The same dagger he had used lifetimes ago. His black veins flared. The cathedral walls shook. Han Subin whispered, Finish it." Minjun breathed in and plunged the dagger into his own chest. The altar split apart. The cathedral collapsed. The entity beneath the altar rose, and Minjun became something else. The dagger slid deep into Minjun's chest. He felt no pain, no struggle, only the sensation of something inside him finally waking up. The cathedral shook violently. The walls cracked, the hooded figures bowing lower, their song rising into an ecstatic, feverish crescendo. The ritual was complete. The thing beneath the altar stirred. Minjun felt it moving through his veins, coiling around his bones, reconstructing him. He wasn't dying. He was becoming. His doppelganger, his true self, smiled. "There you are," he murmured. "Welcome home." The altar exploded. A black surge of energy erupted from the shattered stone, swallowing the cathedral in a storm of shifting tendrils and unearthly voices. Minjun felt his skin rip apart. His body was stretching, unraveling, reshaping. His human form was nothing more than a temporary illusion, dissolving into something more. Han Subin watched with unwavering eyes, her expression unreadable. "You finally understand," she whispered. Minjun's eyes burned. He saw everything. Every lifetime, every ritual, every version of himself that had ever tried to resist. They had all failed, because there was no resisting what he truly was. His doppelganger stepped closer. This was never a curse, Minjun. He reached out, his palm open. This was a gift. Minjun's fingers twitched. The last of his human self was crumbling away. The cathedral's walls collapsed, the hooded figures vanished into the darkness, and Minjun let go. The universe shuddered, and for the first time, the thing that had once been Minjun opened its eyes. The cathedral no longer existed. The hooded figures, the altar, the hymn, all were swallowed by the void. What remained was something vast, endless and formless, and in the center of it all, Minjun opened his eyes. He was no longer a man, no longer a priest, no longer Minjun. He was something else. His body was no longer flesh and bone, but a vast consciousness, stretching beyond dimensions. He could feel time unraveling, memories from thousands of lifetimes overlapping, pressing against his mind. And yet, he was calm. This was the truth he had fought against. And now, it had claimed him. Han Subin stood before him, unchanged. She had not been consumed, not erased, because she had never been a part of the cycle. She had always been watching. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. Minjun's form rippled. His voice, no longer singular but an endless chorus, spoke. "Yes." Han Subin smiled, not with kindness but with satisfaction. "Good." She turned, gazing into the endless dark. "Then it's time." Minjun's many voices merged into one. "Time for what?" She chuckled. "To take your place." And with that, the void split apart. Minjun, or what remained of him, felt himself being pulled forward into something greater, something inevitable, something that had always been waiting. And as he stepped into it, his last human thought faded. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. The void split open. Minjun, what remained of him, was pulled forward, his form stretching, dissolving into something infinite. The space before him was not empty. It had never been. It had been waiting. Minjun's form flickered, between man, shadow, and something far beyond either. The weight of existence pressed into him, pulling him into his place. The throne at the heart of the void was his. It had always been. Han Subin stood beside him, her expression unreadable. She gazed at the throne with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this moment unfold countless times. "This is what you are," she said softly. Minjun's consciousness fractured and reformed. Memories blurred, faces he had known in past lives, rituals, temples, broken oaths, all meaningless now. He reached toward the throne, his fingers stretching into long, dark tendrils. The moment his form touched the seat, the void pulsed. The hymn returned, not from outside, but from within. It was part of him, a song older than time, one he had tried so desperately to forget. And now, he sang it willingly. The cycle was never about resisting. It was about acceptance. Minjun had spent lifetimes denying the truth. Now he would spend eternity embracing it. Han Subin smiled. "Now you finally understand." She bowed, not as an equal, but as a servant. Minjun's form stretched across realities. He was no longer bound by flesh, no longer tethered by a name. He was the hymn. He was the throne. He was the thing waiting beneath the altar, and the world had forgotten him for too long. Minjun, or whatever he had become, finally spoke. His voice was no longer singular, it was every voice. It was the cycle itself. He let them remember. The void shuddered. An existence bent to his will. The void trembled. Minjun, or what remained of him, spoke his command, and the universe obeyed. Reality itself shuddered, rippling outward like a stone dropped into an infinite ocean. The fabric of existence strained, cracked, and then began to shift. The world had forgotten what lay beneath the altar, forgotten the hymn that once whispered in their bones. But now, they would remember. The first to feel it were the priests. In cathedrals, temples, and shrines across the world, their voices faltered mid-prayer. Their hands trembled. The air grew thick, because the gods they prayed to were no longer alone. Then came the dreams. Across cities, villages, and homes, people woke, gasping for air. They could not describe what they saw, what they heard, only that it had a voice, a song they did not know, yet had always known. The song of Mingjun. The old places, the ones long abandoned, began to stir. Ancient ruins, forgotten shrines, buried altars hidden beneath cities, shifted as if something beneath them was breathing again. In underground tunnels, in forgotten tombs, in churches that had stood for centuries, something whispered. And those who listened wept in reverence. Han Subin watched it all unfold with a quiet, knowing smile. She had seen this happen before. She had seen it happen again and again, because Minjun was never meant to be forgotten. And now the world was remembering. The black veins of reality stretched outward. The hymn spread from the cracks, from the forgotten corners of existence, from the ones who had always known but had dared not speak. Minjun, the thing that had once been Minjun, watched from his throne beyond time. He was no longer waiting. He was no longer hidden. He was here, and this time no one would forget. The world had remembered. The shift had started as a whisper, a silent hum, a flickering in the lights, a song on the edge of human consciousness. But now it was a presence. The first to feel it were those already attuned to the unseen, the priests, the monks, the ones who lived in prayer. They knew. In a cathedral in Italy, an archbishop collapsed mid-sermon, clutching his chest as tears spilled down his face. In a forgotten monastery in Tibet, a group of monks sat in silence, eyes closed, hands trembling. The air around them pulsed. One of them whispered, "He is awake." At the Vatican, the Pope awoke from a dream, his heart hammering. He stared at the crucifix in his chamber, and for the first time, he was afraid, because there was something else in the room with him. And then came the worshippers. Those who had always felt the pull of something older than time, something lurking beneath history's surface. They understood. They knew the churches had never been for God. They had been for him. In a megachurch in South Korea, a congregation of thousands gathered for prayer, only to find themselves chanting words they did not recognize. The pastor at the pulpit stared in horror. He hadn't spoken, and yet they sang. Across the world, people knelt, not because they were forced, because they had always been meant to. Han Subin watched from the rooftops, her black eyes reflecting the new truth. Minjin was no longer a god lost to time. He was here, and the first to kneel had already begun. Far beyond, in the void of existence, Minjun, the thing that had once been him, and he waited for the rest to follow. Not everyone knelt. Not everyone wanted to remember, and those who resisted felt something far worse than fear. They felt his gaze. The first to run were the ones who had always known something was wrong with the world, the ones who had whispered in secret that history had been rewritten, that something had been buried beneath time. Now, they were right. In Tokyo, a journalist locked himself in his apartment, trying to type what he had seen. His fingers trembled as he wrote, "There is something coming. No, it's already here." But no matter how fast he typed, the words on his screen kept changing. In London, a professor of theology dropped his glass of whiskey as his bookshelf shook violently. Volumes of forbidden texts tumbled to the ground, pages flipping open on their own. One phrase repeated over and over. "The forgotten one returns." Some tried to leave their cities, to escape into the countryside, to outrun the change. They never made it past the borders, because the roads had changed. Those who tried to flee by sea never reached land again. Their ships drifted in circles, their compasses spinning uselessly. The ocean beneath them was no longer the same ocean. And when the first sailor heard a voice calling his name from the water, he jumped. The ones who tried to hide felt it worst of all, because Minjun was not hunting them. They were calling to him. In a bunker beneath New York, a secret society gathered, clutching rosaries, chanting prayers in desperate, shaking voices. But their gods did not answer, because there was only one now. Han Subin watched them all, the runners, the deniers, the ones who refused to kneel. She sighed. Why did they always fight? She turned her gaze upward, where the sky itself had begun to split open. The time for hiding was ending. Minjun had waited long enough, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. Something shifted above them. The sky, once familiar, once mapped and studied by men, was no longer the same sky. The stars flickered, not in their usual cosmic dance, but in deliberate motion. They were moving, rearranging. In Seoul, a group of astronomers stood in frozen horror as their telescopes showed them something impossible. The constellations were rewriting themselves, and in their place, symbols. Ancient, unknown, but deeply familiar. In Paris, at the Louvre, the glass pyramid cracked. The paintings inside trembled in their frames as if something within them was waking up, reacting to the change. The Mona Lisa's smile shifted. Across the world, birds, millions of them, flew in perfect spirals, their wings synchronized, their patterns forming the same sigil now glowing in the sky. People pointed. People gasped. People prayed. The air itself thickened. The sky trembled. And then, the first rift opened. It began as a thin tear in reality, hovering just above the tallest skyscrapers. At first, it was no more than a hairline fracture. Then, it widened, and something looked through. 1,000 voices screamed at once. Some in terror, some in worship, because it was no longer just Minjun. It was everything he had become, everything he had once been, everything he had tried to forget. And now it remembered itself. Han Subin stood beneath it all, her arms outstretched. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling, not in fear, but in awe. They see you now. The first wave of black light crashed down, and reality began to unravel. The first wave of black light struck the earth. It didn't destroy, it didn't burn. It changed. The rift in the sky continued to widen. What had once been a thin tear was now a gaping wound in reality, stretching from one horizon to the other. And from within it, something moved. Across the world, people fell to their knees, some in agony, some in worship, because the world was no longer the world they knew. The sky above Seoul flickered, the Han River reflecting a different sky entirely, one filled with twisting stars and celestial bodies that did not belong. In New York, the skyline bent. The Empire State Building twisted slightly, its structure not breaking, but reforming, as if it had always been that way. No one remembered what it used to look like. In Cairo, the pyramids turned. Not physically, but something inside them shifted. The hieroglyphs, thousands of years old, changed. They now bore his name. Minjun, or what had once been Minjun, sat upon his throne beyond time. And he saw everything. The streets of Tokyo, where pedestrians walked out of sync with time, their movements lagging, repeating, as if reality had lost its grip. The underground caverns of the Vatican, where statues of saints wept black tears. And the Pope, locked in his chambers, staring at the shifting crucifix on his wall. The abandoned temples in Nepal, where monks, some hundreds of years dead, stood up from their graves. They did not speak, they only turned to face the sky. Han Subin exhaled slowly, watching as the world buckled under his return. This was no invasion. This was a correction. Minjun's voice, or rather the voice of what he had become, whispered across existence. Do not resist. You were always mine. The sky shattered completely, and the world was reborn. The world woke up to a reality they had never known. There was no panic, no confusion, because no one remembered what had come before. The sky was no longer the same sky. The stars above burned in patterns that had never existed. The constellations were gone, replaced by symbols no human could decipher, yet everyone somehow understood. The churches, the temples, the places of old faiths remained, but the gods they had once worshipped were nameless. No prayers were spoken for them, because there was only one now. In classrooms, children learned history that had never happened. Their textbooks spoke of an eternal ruler, a being that had always existed, had always guided them, had always been there, and no one questioned it, because to them it had always been true. Statues rose overnight. Great monuments of Minjun's new form were erected in every nation, though no one could recall when or how they had been built. They were simply there, and always had been. In art museums, paintings changed. Every historical portrait, every sculpture, every fresco had been altered subtly, woven with new details, details that had never been there before. Yet no one noticed, because they had always been there. The memories of the old world were gone. Even the ones who had tried to run, the deniers, the resistors, the ones who had seen the change coming, they too had forgotten. Han Subin stood at the edge of a great city, watching it move like a perfect machine. She had seen this before. She had witnessed the moment where the old world died and the new one took its place. And this time, there would be no undoing it. Minjun, the thing he had become, sat upon his throne, watching. He was not a tyrant. He had not conquered. He had simply corrected. This was how it was always meant to be, and the world accepted him. Not through force, not through violence, but because they had never known anything else, and never would again. Minjun no longer ruled, because he did not need to. The world had no memory of ruling, of defiance, of choice. They existed and they worshiped. That was all. There was no rebellion, no war. Not because of fear, but because there was nothing to rebel against. The people of this world had been born into devotion, and they would die in it. And none of them would ever know. In schools, children learned that their God had no beginning, no past, no history. He simply was. The textbooks had no dates, no wars, no struggles. There had never been an age before this one, because this was the only age that had ever existed. The monuments of the past had reshaped themselves. The Eiffel Tower was no longer a symbol of France. It was a monument to him. The Great Wall of China no longer spoke of dynasties. It was a barrier protecting the sacred. Stonehenge was not ancient. It was his first altar. Hans Subin watched it all with quiet amusement. This was not the first time a world had been rewritten. It would not be the last, because Min Jun had never been just one god. He had always been many. Far beyond, in the space where time no longer mattered, Min Jun sat upon his throne. He did not speak. He did not command, because he did not need to. The world existed as it should.